Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MATC. And this is a regular webinar organized by Mid-American Transportation Center. And this center is composed of major university from 4 states. Nebraska is leading state, Iowa and Kansas State, and also Missouri. So University of Nebraska-Lincoln is the lead of the center and is sponsored by U.S. Department of Transportation. Missouri University of Science and Technology is one of player in this center for the past probably 8 or 10 years at least. So we are very fortunate to be part of this center over the long period of time. Today we have a distinguished speaker, my colleague Steve Corns. Dr. Corns is Associate Professor in Engineering Management and Systems Engineering at the Missouri S&T. He actually graduated from Iowa State University in 2008 with a degree in mechanical engineering. His research interest is mainly focused on computational intelligence applications and the mechanics of information transfer in evolutionary algorithm, as well as model-based approach for complex system design and analysis. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the platform to Steve. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Genda. So yeah, I've also had the good fortune of working with Mid-America Transportation System Center, MoDOT, for the last couple of years, and we're moving forward into another year and keep moving forward with that research. So this is a little bit of some of the work that I've done the last couple of years. I don't have her name on here, but Dr. Susanna Long has been doing a lot of this work with me. She does a lot of supply chain modeling, infrastructure analysis, and these types of things. So it was a pretty natural fit. And it kind of elaborated on some work that we'd done for U.S. Geological Survey. So you'll see them down there at the bottom as well, because we used a lot of their data when we went through and did this work. So as Genda said, I do computational intelligence type work. So I look at different complex phenomena, try to model it, analyze it, and come up with solutions. So the work I've been doing the last couple of years associated with MATC has been focused mainly on flooding and the impact of flooding, regular flooding, flash flooding, but how it affects transportation infrastructure. So a little bit, and if I get the slides on the right one, a little bit of background. As I mentioned, we're looking at floods, we're looking at flash floods. So I'm going to start the talk with regular old flooding, which everybody unfortunately is familiar with, I believe. You've seen some of the flooding in different areas. I know in Kansas, Missouri River floods on occasion. Once in a while, we'll have flooding from the Mississippi River. This actually is the Merrimack River that we have in the upper right here. And this was not very many years ago. This was a 2015 flood, if I remember correctly. This is Interstate 44. This is the interstate that connects Rolla to St. Louis. It's also one of the 5 major interstates that goes into St. Louis. And I don't have the map here, but if you pull up a map of St. Louis and you look at it, and you look at the different rivers that have to have bridges over it, if those bridges all go out, St. Louis turns into an island. There is no overland route except for through the Mark Twain National Forest. It's one of the national forests, and there's no roads going through that. So St. Louis is very susceptible to flooding. So we're going to take a look at how St. Louis was impacted by some of these. And you notice all the semis and the cars trying to get through the last road that's open. This is an overpass. So this entire road all the way up to the bridge ended up flooding. And later on, I-44 flooded out as well. So it's a serious problem in the St. Louis area. It has a lot of impact. Flash flooding, we're also going to look at, also has an impact on the transportation network. You see the picture here is just water topping the road, but there's a couple things to pick up from this. Number one, it's not raining. There's not a requirement that it be raining for flash flood to occur, although it can usually occur during a rainstorm. It can also occur at night, in which case this is very difficult to see, especially in the rain. A couple of years ago, we had the misfortune of losing some soldiers over in Fort Wood who were driving back to Rolla from someplace, I believe it was Jefferson City, because they came up on a flooded roadway, didn't have enough warning, and just couldn't stop. And if we go back to some of our statistics, if water is topping over the road like this is probably okay to drive through, right? Well, water weighs roughly 1,000 times as much as air. So if you're looking at water flowing, just a little bit of water hitting your tires, multiply that by 1,000, that's almost the same as having that same speed of air or more hitting your car with just a couple inches of water. It takes about how much water to actually pick up a car and take it off a roadway? Does anybody remember that? About 6 inches of water will pick up a car and carry it off of a roadway. These flash floods are unpredictable. Well, I shouldn't say unpredictable because that's what we did, but they're difficult to predict and they happen very quickly. Whereas these large floods, we see them coming, but there's so much water, they're just unavoidable. So a couple different things that we're going to look at, and there's difficulties in predicting each of them. So we use different approaches for that. So like I said, St. Louis is one of the main areas we're going to focus on. And everybody's familiar with the arch. We have the Mississippi River with a nice road down in front of it. This is after they did all the renovations. So we have a very nice green area down here. But if you look at the road through here and the steps leading up to it, if we look at that same flood, this is the impact of that flood. That road is gone. So it has completely taken that road out and the water is coming up the steps. You have 2 sets of these steps left. So the water is somewhere around here. And this was the flood of 2015. This was not the largest flood that we've had in St. Louis. As far as historical information, the flood of 93 actually crested higher at St. Louis. So the flood of 93 looked like this. It's a little bit harder to see, but the crest was 10 foot higher than the flood of 2015. So 10 feet, that is more than probably whatever room you're in. It's a couple feet taller than the ceiling of that room if you look up. So that's the impact of this water. 1 million cubic foot of water per second went down the Mississippi River. So this is from the National Weather Service. A crest of almost 50 foot. 2015 was somewhere around the order of 38 feet and some change. So about 10-foot difference. Now we have all these different flood stages, action stages, different categories for looking at the water. I have a question, 6 inches of water at what velocity? I can't really remember the velocity, but there is a velocity associated with that, correct? So I can look that up for you when we get done with the talk. I don't want to Google it on the fly, although I'm very tempted to. But it's not as fast as you think it would be. So looking at this picture, flood's fairly serious, right? And we're all familiar with this 100-year floods, things like this. And we show that it flooded out that road that goes down beneath the arch, but what does that actually have to do with transportation systems? Well, you know, it is going to flood out some roads. Why do we care about notifying people? Well, if we get back to the 6 inches of water taking a car, pushing it off a road, this is footage from 93. This was in St. Charles County. This is just people trying to make that decision of, I'm stuck here, do I drive across this flooded road or do I sit here and wait for help? And that was the decision that we're trying to avoid people making. If they had advance notice, if they knew that the roads were going to be flooded in a timely manner, then they can avoid these situations. So that was a goal of this was actually the first year of the work. Now, the other issue is with flash floods. So these happen a lot more quickly. So this comes from Kansas City MoDOT. And you notice this semi was just pushed off the side of the road. It is raining, but it's not raining really heavy here. But still, there's enough water moving so that this vehicle was pushed off the side of the road. Looked like it might have jackknifed also, given the direction. You see another car down here. So flash flooding has less warning than the major flooding. Although it's not as widespread, it's probably more dangerous. And again, because it happens quickly, it's more difficult to predict. So can we avoid these types of situations where we have large amount of flooding pushing people off the roads, people trying to decide whether or not they're actually going to drive across this flooded roadway? So we came up with a couple different mechanisms for this. The first one, we're looking at flood. So we have large amounts of rainfall upstream. We have a large snow melt. This happens probably, I would say every 10 years, we get some kind of flooding that we could actually measure. We've been getting a lot of those 100-year floods. That definition is a little tricky. That statistical analysis of how often these happen. But we get flooding fairly regularly. So if we can look at the flood data, the information we get on it, then we can look at different protocols, how we actually deal with this. So we did this using publicly available data. There's a lot of information out there that, while individually doesn't tell us whether or not this road is likely to be flooded, if we start organizing this into some form of framework, then we can figure out what the likelihood of that flood event is going to be. So eventually predict these different flood events. If we know that the flooding is coming, we know when it's going to be flooded, then we can start preparing the road for closures, advance notice. We also want to look at situations similar to the little boy who cried wolf, right? If people go down a road and they see that the road's closed, it's going to be flooded, and there's no flooding, then they start losing faith in the prediction mechanism. So we want to make sure that it's accurate, it's timely, but it does keep people from having to go down that road and then make that decision of whether or not, do I turn around, backtrack however many miles, or just try to get through the flooded roadway. So what we used for this was a combination of some different instruments. We had gauge height. We got information from Army Corps of Engineers. They have different gauges. They determine the height of the water. And we can look at that and we can try to determine, well, what is the trend? How are we actually going to have the water level increasing over time? So to do that, we use time series prediction to take all these different data points up to a particular point, predict what the water level is going to be after a certain amount of time in the future. We are looking at about 15-minute increments, which matches up with what the Army Corps of Engineers flood gauges use. We take this information and we combine it with USGS flood inundation maps. So this tells us, depending on what the gauge height is, the water level is going to rise to a certain area, and that kind of fills up whatever basin we're in, and it increases the overall water level, what part of the surface area is covered. Then we take a road map, we overlay that, determine which roads are going to be flooded. That gives us an idea of when the roads are going to be flooded. Now we can take that information and we can put that into a traffic simulation. We can look at what happens if we close down these roads. What are the delays? How likely is it that people are going to have to take extra time? What's the cost, indirect cost associated with this, which is number 4. If we close down roadways, if people can't get to work, then that's going to impact the overall economics of the region. So we developed this framework and we analyzed it in a case study location. So we work with Missouri Department of Transportation. We work with different individuals we talked to about where does this flooding occur. St. Louis was a natural fit. So within St. Louis, that intersection I showed you before, historically has had flooding. The last major flooding there was 2017. This is the intersection of Interstate 44 and Highway 141, which is an arterial for going around St. Louis on the western side. Fair amount of traffic on both, 4-lane highway for 141. I-44 obviously is an interstate. So this is what it looked like. Now this isn't the Mississippi River, but this is the Merrimack River. It feeds into the Mississippi River fairly close to the St. Louis area, a little bit further south. And this photo comes from the National Weather Service. You can see here is the signage for the road that's under the water. So major flooding, intersection had to be closed down. If this occurs, how do people get around this and get to their final destination? So we can look at the different flood stages. There's an action stage where we prepare it at 11 foot. Flooding is at 16 foot. Major flood is at 25 foot. Then there are other things that we can look at for historical flood data. So this gives us an idea of when these different events occur. And we use this as part of that flood inundation map to determine what's going to affect the roadway. So the first thing we need is figure out what are these water levels. So to measure the stage, we have these different instruments that the USGS and Army Corps of Engineers both work with these. There's a water intake bubble system. It basically works on a differential pressure to determine what the water surface level is. Then this information is transmitted via satellite to stations where they gather it, analyze it, record it. So this is where we got our river stage height for the Merrimack River. And this information is available and it's recorded. USGS has this information. So we work directly with them. And they have this tool for a flood inundation map. There are different locations where they have this information. These green triangles with the black triangle inside it indicate where these particular sets of information are associated with these gauges. So this is also part of the reason why we selected this particular intersection. You see here, this is Highway 141 and this is Interstate 44. So this intersection has one of these indicators very close to it. Now, there are other indicators in the St. Louis area. There are several in the Kansas City area. We have better access to St. Louis from Rolla. So it helped us kind of visualize the intersection. And also we were working with some of the folks in St. Louis for working with Missouri Department of Transportation. So that also helped. There's a common interest within that area. So we can look at these flood tools and we can gather some of the information. So the services and data has some of that historical information. We can use that as time series data. So for the flood stages, we look at several different things. We have an action stage. The action stage, nothing has really come out of its banks so far, but this is a point where we start getting concerned. So that is 11 foot for this particular gauge. Flood stage, now we start to see the river coming out of its banks. You notice down here, low-lying area, we start getting flood. There is a height given within the flood inundation map that tells us what the actual height of the water is. This actually comes from ArcGIS, the map that we create here. We create different layers depending on the different geographical region. We can take the information that we get from the U.S. Geological Survey, we import that as another layer on the ArcGIS software. That allows us to overlay what the flood values are onto the actual geographical information. So moderate flooding, we can see that it's getting out of the banks a little bit more to major flooding. So you see how as we cycle through, we raise that value for the river height indicator. It shows different areas of the river, the vicinity of the river, and where the water is actually going, where it's flowing into, what it's covering. Now, this alone doesn't give us information about what roadways are going to be closed or what roadways are going to be overtopped. There's another layer in ArcGIS that has the actual traffic, the roadway network. So what's required here is we take this, we save it as raster information, we overlay that, and we do an intersection on ArcGIS to determine what part of the road network intersects with these areas that are actually covered by water. And that gives us an idea of what part of the road network is actually flooded. So the first thing we do with this model framework is we get this data. We acquire the information about what are the historic values for the river level indications. We look at the information for the particular area, in this case, the intersection I-44 and Highway 141. And over several years, we pick out that information and we try to determine what is the trends. If we see this particular behavior, what's the gauge height going to be in the next 15 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours? So to do that, we move into our computational intelligence models. So for this, we use a neural network. This is, for those of you not versant in the computational intelligence stuff, this is a computer program that approximates a function. It works similarly to the brain, where we have different neurons, connections between the neurons, and based on the input, whether or not the neurons fire, how much they fire. What we do here is we look at the inputs and we map these inputs to some particular result. So if I have a certain amount of information about the river stage, say the previous 10 values of river stage, I can plug that in there and I try to predict what the next river stage is going to be in the next 15 minutes, in the next half hour. I do that and I keep looking at the information and I adjust different weights within this network until the inputs map to that desired output. So that's training my neural network. We did this dropout. If anybody's interested in the computational intelligence, I could give you more details on dropout, some of the different techniques we used, but this made it to where we picked up the more significant information that gives us that mapping more accurately. So what that looked like is we have a river stage. We predict what the river stage is, and we compare that to other methodologies. And it gives us a decent representation of what's going to happen with the water level at this river. We take that information, what the water level is going to be, we use that flood inundation profile. We map that to the different road segments. We determine what road segments are going to be closed within the next however many minutes. Is it going to be 1 hour? Is it going to be 2 hours? Then we start closing the road segments. Taking that information, we come up with methods for rerouting our road network. This tells us how far we're going to be redirecting traffic because we have to put the road network into a safe condition. All of this rerouting is going to cost extra money. If a vehicle is on the road for an extra hour, then there's going to be extra costs associated with that. Extra fuel. If it's a driver, then it's going to be extra hours that they're driving. If it's something that needs to be delivered at a particular time, then adjustments might have to be made. Truck drivers work on delivering whatever their cargo is by a certain time. So this has monetary costs. It has costs for time delays. It could impact these businesses as well for the transportation network. So that's the general idea of what we're looking at for this particular project. Again, test site I-44, 141. It's flooded a lot. There's a lot of flooding that's happened. We have a lot of information for gauge height from May 19, 2016 up to, for this particular work, we are looking at 2019. So about 3 years worth of data. And that comes in 15-minute increments. So it gives us a nice test bed for analyzing this. We used a deep learning neural network, which this is a neural network with several layers, different types of layers. Again, I can go into the machine learning a little bit more specifically, but this is a way of taking our inputs and mapping it to some particular output. It can be multiple outputs. The deep set of layers allows us to identify different features, different combinations of things that indicate an underlying relationship. And then we can use that to make better predictions of what's going to happen in future states. So the deep learning actually gave us a fairly large benefit in trying to identify this time series information. So every hour we generate a lot of data, a lot of things go into this. And this gives us the ability to create models, and with sufficient information leading back in time, we can identify things that have led to dangerous conditions in the past. So the particular type of deep learning algorithm we used was a LSTM. So without getting into huge amounts of detail, our normal neural network, this is a recurrent neural network, has a memory. It keeps track of things that led to a particular condition. So it is good for remembering everything about the relationship that it's been analyzing, but it remembers everything. There are some things that are at different time scales that may have different impact on what those relationships are. So the benefit of using this long short-term memory mechanism, this LSTM, is that we have a long-term memory and we have a working memory. So a lot of what these neural networks work off of for determining forecasting like this is feature extraction, identifying the features, the things that are going to lead to the condition we're trying to predict. When they identify good features, we can put that into our long-term memory. This gives the algorithm the capability of remembering, hey, this is an important relationship. We store this and we use this for our future predictions, but we still keep track of what's going on locally, recently with the algorithm. So it gives us more flexibility in how we actually predict. To look at this maybe a little more analytically, this gives us a much higher prediction accuracy than just a recurrent neural network. So after looking at all this time series data, this is a little bit tricky to actually tell apart because the algorithm did a very good job of predicting. The blue is the original data. If you look really closely, it didn't do a great job there. You can see a couple outliers where the original data was a little bit higher, but by and large, it mapped very well to the actual training data, which is the real data that we observed had the information for all those different gauge heights from the USGS. And then we have predictions. So we take these predictions and we map it, compare it to what the actual gauge height is from, this is somewhere around, if I remember correctly, somewhere around March of 2019 up till September. So fairly accurate, although there is one caveat. This is predicting the next 15 minutes, which is valuable. But if the flooding is going to occur sooner than that, or if you have to shut down the road sooner than 15 minutes, say it takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes to get to the point where the flooding is, the 15-minute interval is not going to do quite as well as you would want. So the comparison we actually looked at is as we look forward in time. Now we're looking at, if you see this from September 1 to September 3, we're predicting out 2 days. This is our prediction, the blue with the LSTM. This is the USGS's prediction in green, the one up top. So they predicted a much higher gauge height. It's somewhere around 6 to 7 foot is what USGS predicted. The red is the original data. This is the actual gauge height. So if you look at this, it doesn't look like a great prediction maybe, but this is going out predicting 48 hours. The current prediction mechanism for if we're going to have flooding looking at the next incident of flooding in a roadway is how long? Anybody know? Anybody looked at that? It's about 6 hours. So we're moving from 6 hours to about 15-minute intervals. So while we look at the 6 hours, we're a little bit off here. Every time we get one of these intervals, if we go back to this prediction, we can update our prediction. This is without updating the information. So this is a prediction. If I stop giving it data at 6 p.m. on this day, 6 a.m. the next day, I predict here, which is still much better than what USGS predicted. So as far as looking how far out it's actually going to predict, we did a better job. We also give a much earlier warning than the current systems, which is every 6 hours. Now we're giving information every 15 minutes. And that's much more closely tied to what we would expect with road networks. So once we have that flood information, now we can look at where's the water. This is the highest recorded stage height. This is the highest value that USGS had, 54 foot. And this is the impact. So this is looking at just the flood data on the map. We had to process that into raster to point so that we actually indicate the road network. Then we do our intersection. So where is it that this flood actually hits a road? And that tells us what part of the road is being flooded out. So those are the steps that we took in ArcGIS. And that allows us to identify what portions of the road network are going to be flooded, need to be shut down. And we can use that flood model, that information on the flood model, to look at what actually happens to the roads, when do we actually shut them down, when do we actually send warning to the drivers. And that can be used to determine a new road network, what has been closed, what's been removed, and we can use a routing algorithm to update that. So normally I would just go ahead and talk about the routing algorithm now, but since there's commonality between the routing algorithm and what we actually do with the flash flood prediction, I'm going to go ahead and jump into that flash flood prediction. So flash flood prediction. We looked at a different area. This happened back in 2010. Flash flooding this is the Springfield area, Springfield, Missouri. So flooding occurs quite a bit. It's inconvenient. This is, well, you probably don't want to be driving in it. If it happens quickly, people can get stranded. Typically, we look at things like this when we think about flash flooding. Now, we talked about the turnaround, don't drown, where we want to keep people from going down a flooded roadway. How do we do that? With flash floods, that's a lot more difficult because we have to predict the flooding. The people may already be there when the flash flood event's going to occur, or we may have a lot less warning. So the idea of this is to try to provide flash flooding warning to originally first responders, bus drivers, different people in these areas so that we can give a warning to the people who are going to be out there driving around during these bad weather events. So flash flooding happens, it's localized, it's quick, but it's not as large and pervasive as a regular flooding event. Whereas a flood, it may take weeks for the water to recede. Flash flood, you're usually looking at something in the order of hours. So to look at this, whereas we knew the water was coming with a flooding event, now we have to look at where's the water coming from. Snow melt doesn't cause flash flooding, right? Unless we want to look at a levee being breached or something along those lines, that's a separate event. So flash flood, typically there has to be some rainfall event within the area. So trying to come up with information that's going to be relevant to flash flooding is a little bit different. Here we're looking at historical flash flood sites. we can look at the map, we can identify low-lying areas for flooding. For flash flooding, it doesn't have to be a low-lying area for the flash flooding to occur. It just has to be an area where there's a large accumulation of rain. So to identify the areas, we look at historical data, when it happened, where it happened, and whether or not it's happened more than once. So we can take this, and again, we use our GIS software, and we identify where these are. We look at what are the relationships. Can we map this to weather data? Process the data so we can figure out what the location of the flood is. And now we have to start looking at some different heuristics for reasons I'm going to bring up here in a second. The flash flood data is not quite as pinpoint accurate as some of your flood data. I believe that's a good way of putting it. Once we've identified these locations, we've identified the weather conditions, now we can start looking at the map, looking at elevation, looking at different factors, converting this into information we can use and then pass into an algorithm to determine whether or not we think there's going to be flash flooding in the next however many hours. Then we take this information, we can do traffic simulations. We can reroute, we can figure out how long is it going to take to get to the next destination. This needs to be tied in as part of an assessment for how important is it to get from A to B and what is the likelihood of flash flooding to occur. Whereas flooding, we could pretty much guarantee the flooding is going to happen, it's just when. Flash flooding, again, more difficult to predict whether or not it is going to occur. I guess a good example of this would be how many of you have actually seen a flooded area? When we had a flood, say of 93, even going back to 2017, most of us have seen some kind of flood. How many of you have actually seen a flash flood other than in a movie? Personally observed a flash flood? It's a lot lower because they're quick, they happen quickly, they go away quickly. So fortunately, we do have people out there kind of like storm spotters looking for all kinds of different events. And everybody's familiar with storm spotters chasing tornadoes and all these things. We have people observing other things as well. And NOAA keeps a database of this. So National Oceanographic Atmospheric Association, I believe I have that correctly. They have a database of dense fog, dust devils, excessive heat, freezing fog, but flash flooding is one of the things they have on here that we were concerned with. So we took Missouri for an area of interest. We, in this case, looked at Greene County, and we pulled up information on flash flooding to see what all was out there, what was available for analysis. This is what that data looks like. So here we have the date of the event, the date it begins, the latitude, the longitude, and a narrative. So slow-moving storm caused heavy rain to occur across the southern and central Missouri. The event followed quickly on the heels of a previous flood event that occurred from the 4th through the 6th of January. Therefore, soils were nearly saturated at the onset of the event. The lack of January vegetation also contributed to runoff and flooding. In Greene County, the primary areas that flooded were low water crossings and low-lying areas. Other specific locations that were affected by flooding include areas along Ward Branch Creek in Springfield, a section of Highway CC 2 miles west of Fairgrove, the intersection of Farm Road 235 and Highway E, the intersection of Farm Road 231 and 2. This is the information we had to work with. So this is not numerical data, which is what we had when we were looking at flooding. This is reports from storm spotters. The difficulty with this, and now I'm kind of wishing I would have included this slide, is the creek that they were talking about, this Ward Branch Creek in Springfield, is about 20 miles from this latitude and longitude. So these are general areas, and this actually mapped to low-lying areas closer to Springfield. So there's a lot of error introduced by these narratives. We also had these event narratives where we look at other points of data, information about flash flooding. So it gives us information, but it doesn't tell us specifically what roads were flooded, what roads were impacted by these events. It gives us a general area. So working through that data took a fair amount of time. And this is why we use that nearest neighbor algorithm, where we look at the latitude, the longitude, what are the roads close to those areas, and how does that compare with the actual episode narrative, event narrative. But this gives us an idea of where the flash flooding was occurring, and it gives us a general sense with a little bit of fuzziness as far as where that flash flood event occurred. So the information that actually tied to this, that gave us a little bit of a feel for whether or not there's going to be an accumulation of rainfall, were elevation, slope, aspect, and curvature. These are things that came out of our ArcGIS software. So elevation, that is the height above sea level. We can get that from the national map. So that's available from USGS. They have maps of the entire state of Missouri, the entire US. So lots of information there, but the slope, the change in elevation, we have to get that information from other data sets. Aspect, so what direction is the slope actually moving in? Is it running from north to south, east to west? And then curvature. This would be, and hopefully I don't, looks like we don't have the annotation on, so I'm not going to draw this, but the curvature of the slope is it concave, concave, convex? Is it fairly linear, straight line? So what does that aspect look like? So that gives us an idea of what the hill actually, the shape of it, how tight of a slope it is, how much the water is going to run down it. All of this is available through the ArcGIS software. There are different data layers we can look at. So this gives us an idea of what the actual land looks like. So we had to pick an area, something that was kind of near and dear to the folks we were working with. So a couple areas came up, Newton County and Greene County. Newton County has flash flooding. They've had issues with it. We had better information for Greene County. So we started off with Greene County. We're hoping to expand this into Newton County at some point. But for this analysis, we looked at Greene County in the Springfield area. So this map was generated from the national map, from the ArcGIS software, the different layers. It's typically a square map. We trimmed off the sides to capture this particular watershed. So, so that allows us to take all the different surrounding areas for where the water drainage is. We've identified here are areas where flash flooding has occurred in the past. We identified areas that have similar features to what we found here, but did not experience flash flooding. So this gives us yes, flash flooding, no flash flooding. It gives us something that we can take, give to that algorithm that we're looking at, deep learning algorithm, whatever methodology we're using for our computational intelligence approach, and try to figure out what makes these different. Why do these red dots, those locations have flash flooding, while these ones with the green dots don't? So for the data, we looked at all of our ArcGIS information. The elevation also gives us the road maps. So we take all those different flash flood events, we do a nearest neighbor algorithm, identify the road that they occurred on. We gather the information about elevation, slope, curvature, and we combine that with historical weather information. When did it rain? How much did it rain? Where did it rain? So all of this combined should give us a feel for what's happening in this particular area and whether or not we're going to have flash flooding there. So this was input to deep learning and machine learning tools. We used a few of them to try to get a feel for what's going to work well for us. And this is pretty much what it looked like. We used the rainfall the day of the flash flood. We also looked at 3 days before. If we go back to this, we saw in the narrative that previous flood event occurred, so the soil was saturated. That previous rain is important in predicting these flood events. So rather than just say, yes, it was saturated, no, it wasn't, we looked at the rainfall. We looked at different numbers of days. We went out to, I think, 7 days was the furthest we went out. The best result came from 3 days of rainfall, 3 days before. Summation of the antecedent rainfall, so summation of how much rainfall happened beforehand, our curvature aspect, slope, elevation, and then also class label. And the class label is this: did we have a flash flood? Did we not have a flash flood? So that's what we use to train the algorithm. We use a deep learning neural network. We also use support vector machine, artificial neural network, and regression analysis. So we looked at some different ways of training this, coming up with whether or not we're going to have a flash flood and trying to predict the likelihood of it. So again, artificial neural network, support vector machine, logistic regression. So we looked at the artificial neural network before. A support vector machine, we actually use this along with the neural network, but this gives us a way of partitioning data that's a little bit different than what we do in a standard neural network. I can, again, visit with folks if you're interested in that, but I didn't want to get too much in the details of it. And logistic regression, we do curve fitting, right? So everyone's seen the logistic regression. So here's our results. We have the things we want to look for are, in this case, the blues. So this is no, there was not flash flooding, and no, there was not flash flooding. So correct. The one means true. So predicted there was flash flooding, and there was flash flooding. So the upper right and lower left are the ones that they got wrong. So our artificial neural network did best. It did pretty well. We're looking at 75 correct to 13 wrong. So we're somewhere, what would that be? 75, 85, 88. Yeah, we're about 70% accurate, thereabouts. And it did better than the other three, although there are similarities between it. Now, also, you notice that all of these were weighted to the true label is a flood, not predicting the flood. You could argue that it would be better to predict that there's a flash flood, even if there's not. A false positive is probably better than a false negative. So that's something we could work with. We can train the algorithm to try to err on that side, but it did fairly well. It gives us a probability of whether or not that road is actually going to be have a flash flood event, and then we can sort based on that probability. So be happy to share the percentages here at some other point, but I did want to get into the road networks, how we actually are going to rearrange traffic, reroute things because of the flooding, where we lost some of these different road networks. So now this is looking at the floods. You can see that we lost a lot of the different roads going through that I-44, 141 intersection area. To figure out how we actually reroute things, we use this SUMO, Simulation of Urban Mobility, to determine what the best routes were. We looked at the different flood mapping, we looked at the network, what were the deleted roadways, and we fed this into this traffic simulator. So for the simulation, we did 60-minute runs. We had one vehicle entering per second, trying to match that up to roughly what we would see on I-44. And then we had different parameters, why people were doing this traffic, or why people were doing this traveling. 40% doing work, 40% social activities, 20% other. That feeds more into the actual cost, the indirect cost. We look at the origin destination. We use a uniform distribution of where they start and where they go to. We did have to kind of expand out so that there was some way of getting from this part of the network to the opposite part of the network so that it was actually solvable. So this is what we found. There's a fairly substantial delay when we started looking at the disrupted road network. So there are more cars traveling on the network because traffic is moving slower, and overall it took people longer to get to their destination. So that allows us to make an estimate of how much longer people are on the road, what are the increased indirect costs. And you could also imagine that if it's people doing social things, it's the frustration element, causing people to maybe do things that aren't quite as safe. So you could argue there's a mapping there, although I don't have a whole lot of proof on that. That's more anecdotal. Flash flooding, we did a similar type of thing where we looked at the flash floods. These are the areas where we predicted a high probability of flash flooding based on the weather and based on that map that we created. So we delete those flooded roads from the network, and we do a similar type of analysis where we look at having one vehicle per second. We look at how long it actually takes them, how many cars are on the road. So what is the average travel time? And we can map that as well. And we can look at the average wait time, how much time people are waiting to get to their destination. So it gives us a feel for how much longer people are on the roads, which can tie into other elements, but also a nice measurable thing, since I am an engineer, is the indirect cost. So based on the purpose of the trip, how much time was added to it, this gives us an idea of how much extra time on the road people spent and what the actual cost per hour was. So taking this mix of work trip, social trip, and other trips, different types of people on the road, what the actual cost to them would be, we came up with something along the order of $5,500 per hour that this flood event occurred, taking out this road network. So it gives us a way of measuring and evaluating how bad the flood impacts us financially, but also where we need to shut down these roads to keep people from being endangered. So this focused mainly on Missouri, although you could expand this into other states if the data is available to train the algorithm with. We used a lot of deep learning algorithms to try to capture that spatial information, to capture the information, the different time frames, lead times. That ties in with flash flood prediction as well. All of this information we put into the routing protocols to give us an idea of what roads are going to be closed and when to close them, and also kind of a feel for what the indirect costs were for making these road closures. So acknowledgements, MoDOT's been great to us, as well as Mid-America Transportation Center. So I've been working with y'all for a couple of years now, and hopefully we're starting up work on the next project. USGS, very generous with their data. It's all publicly available. They have a lot of information out there if anybody wants to look at those things. So they were also very supportive and had a bunch of great graduate students and undergraduate students working with us. So I'm getting close to time, so I should probably stop talking and see if there's any questions.
Any questions?
I have a few questions. Maybe,
Sure.
You'll tell me when to stop, because I definitely want to give time to everybody. So Stephen, thank you so much for sharing your work. I think I had an opportunity to see some of it before. This is a more comprehensive view, though, and more complete. So thanks for that. So let me start with just one issue that I have with the results that you are showing. And I'm going to start with flooding, what you're categorizing as flooding, this large scale kind of river flooding. And my first impression there is that you're giving yourself too easy problem to solve with the artillery that you have, right? You have this huge machine learning algorithms, and you want to predict the next, say, this prediction of like the one you presented of the next 15 minutes. And, obviously your graphs look almost perfect, because, if I tell you that in the next 15 minutes, what's happening is what's happening right now, then you can probably do as good or better than the algorithm. Things obviously get more difficult as your horizon period for prediction grows. right? And at this scale of that river, you probably can look at the data of the time window that is important is when things were in a situation where nothing was happening, in a situation where, you know, significant flooding was happening. That's probably, you know, a window of days in between those. And those are the scales that matter, because, you know, otherwise things are already developing and you're in the middle of the situation when you're predicting. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that the persistence of the time series that you're trying to predict, especially in flows, it's a good indicator on when you're adding information with, you know, all the prediction algorithms. So that's one. Second is on the prediction of this stage, right? So in hydrologists, we tend to do prediction of stream flow, of how much water is going through, because predicting a stage has this added uncertainty of, you know, what's actually happening in the ground. So the maps that you're looking at, the USGS, were developed with a particular topography and a particular set of construction of buildings and so on. And they are developed for the most part for steady state situations, right? So they assume that you have a flow that is going permanently, and that leads to that inundation. That inundation can happen, and the stages that are achieved will change depending on the hydraulics of the event. You know, whether you have an extended period, short period. And in the particular case that you illustrated, I would be kind of mindful or at least wary of downstream conditions. You know, I think this place is maybe, I don't know, 10 kilometers away from the Mississippi River. And, you know, one thing is what's going to happen to this area when you have the Mississippi River, you know, running low and nice, you can take all the water coming down, or the situation where you have, you know, significant flooding in the Mississippi that can actually back propagate into the river.
Right.
So those are some things too. They wanted to kind of hear your comments on that. And the third one is that it wasn't very clear to me on the prediction on the flash flooding, that if you were using in your model the prediction, the rainfall of the day, in order to make a prediction about the flash flooding of the day, for these algorithms to be useful, you would have to rely on really a prediction of what the rainfall is going to be tomorrow to tell you what the inundation, that flash flooding that can occur tomorrow is, right? Otherwise, the two events are kind of simultaneous and kind of defeats the purpose of predicting what happened in the past or what is already happening. So I think that, you know, that those two issues there, I would like to hear your thinking about that. Okay.
So I'll start with the flash flood, just because you said that last, and I remember that pretty well. So yeah, the rainfall for the day is, you can rerun the model. The model only takes less than a minute to actually run. So you can take up to the present time actual rainfall measured. So if we think about the prediction, if we're going to predict whether or not the flash flooding is going to occur within the next 2 hours, we run the model and we can get a value. And that's the rainfall up to the particular time. So we can use that. You could probably argue, well, we could use prediction for what the rainfall is going to be. Now you're using a prediction, feed into a prediction. And anybody who has done this work before knows that it's kind of like making a copy of a copy. It just starts degrading, and you just start amplifying your errors. So if you want to get just a real rough view, you could probably do that, but you got to remember that you're not making a great prediction. I wouldn't give it a wonderful accuracy. And if it's the next day on the flash flood, you probably could just as well flip a coin. That's about how much faith I would have in that prediction. But if you have the data up to a certain point, you should be able to get some degree of accuracy. But that means you have to run it multiple times, which is doable, but.
And I guess that ties with the previous question that I was asking is, what is the timeliness of a forecast, right? Because, 2 hours could be little or 2 hours could be a lot, depending on the communication, the kind of the stream of information, how it travels to the person that is going to react.
Right. And flash flood, 2 hours is a long time. It's probably too far ahead, because if it's 2 hours out, it would be great to predict it that far out, but it's going to be really challenging. Flash flood.
Okay, so maybe I misunderstood when you said your input information in your flash flooding, because I thought you were referring to these daily time scales.
Going back 2 days, but if I remember correctly, we're looking at about 10-minute intervals. If you go to the weather radar, they update about every 10 minutes. So we're looking at something along those lines. So yeah, that probably wasn't as clear in the presentation, so I apologize for that.
Yeah, thank you. And about flooding.
Yep, the hydraulic connectivity, you're absolutely right. Downstream has a huge effect on it. And also there can be zero flooding coming from upriver, and we can still have water backing up if it's something like flood of 93. That can cause flooding itself just because the Mississippi River was so flooded. Part of this, it's, if we look at 15-minute intervals for gauge height, then that's a pretty easy problem to solve. I agree. Trying to predict it out, we had better luck with the LSTM than with other algorithms. So we went with the big iron, if you want to call it that, the complicated algorithms. We did get a better result, and it mapped a little bit better to what we found for the actual algorithms, better than the USGS method. So yeah, that downstream data is crucial. We don't take that into account.
Yeah. Stephen, thank you so much. I think that's the point of my comment, is that, when you analyze the information to kind of keep in mind the window of prediction that is relevant to the problem that you're addressing there. But other than that, like I said, you have a powerful machine, put it on the difficult problem.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we will stop here. And if you have more questions, please contact Dr. Corns individually. Janet, I suppose Steve's email is available to everyone, right? Oh, now he's sent to everyone. So yeah, please contact him individually. Thanks, Dr. Corns, once in a while for an interesting presentation. And we look forward to future MATC webinar participation from all of you. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Genda. Thanks, everyone.